Good afternoon. On behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension dairy educators, I want to thank you for joining our Dairy Margin Coverage 2023 sign-up update. I am Jackie McCarville, a regional dairy educator for Grant, Greene, Iowa, and Lafayette counties. I am now going to turn this over to Lissa Seafelt, dairy and livestock educator for Eau Claire County.
Thanks, Jackie. I'd like to welcome everybody today, and I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We have Leonard Polzin with us today, and he grew up on a century-old Wisconsin dairy farm and received his bachelor degrees in dairy science and agricultural business from UW River Falls, and a Master of Science in agricultural food and resource economics from Michigan State University. He has extensive experience as an educator, farmer, and analyst. His work focuses on dairy markets, outlook, expectations, risk management, trade, and policy. And we're happy to have Leonard with us today as our dairy markets and policy outreach specialist. So thank you so much for being here, Leonard, and the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much. Really appreciate all of you taking time out of your day today to join us for this. So hopefully you'll find it of value. And as we go along, if you have questions, I encourage you to ask. We'll be kind of monitoring the chat box. So if you have something that does come up, feel free to let us know and we can address it as we proceed here. So the goal of the day, of course, is to take a look at the Dairy Margin Coverage 2023 sign up. So we're going to take a look at the sign up date that's coming up, and then if there's any potential changes, and then also kind of take a look at why somebody might want to participate in this program. And the decisions or the decision thought process, if you will, that a producer might want to consider when enrolling in the program. So here's kind of a outline of what we're going to talk about today. Some risk management options that are generally available to dairy producers, what to consider when you're choosing one of those options. And then, of course, dairy margin coverage is one of those choices, right? So we're going to talk about dairy margin coverage, how it works, and what enrollment in that looks like. So, and then part of that decision making is to take a look at historic performance and what the current forecast is telling us. And then finally, we'll take a look at the web tool that's been designed for DMC that helps you as an individual input your information to make sure that you get the decisions and information out to make sure that the decisions or the sign up, if you will, that you elect is appropriate for your operation. So if you haven't done so already, right at the bottom of the screen, it says DMC enrollment deadline. That is December 9th. So I encourage you to grab a sheet of paper, grab a pen, a marker, a crayon, whatever's handy, and write that date down. So it has, in different years, it's been different dates, right? So we want to make sure that people are aware of that date and that they're not referencing something that may have been for a different year. So December 9th, and it's coming up quick. It's approximately 4 weeks away, which sounds like a lot, but I think it will sneak up on us sooner than later. So again, December 9th, make sure that's burned into your brain, hopefully by the end of the presentation, so you don't miss the deadline. All right, so let's take a look at what some of our risk management options are in the dairy markets. So the first one is do nothing, or self-insure, if you will. So this is not an unrealistic option, or I should say potentially unrealistic, but it may not be a wrong option, if you will, right? If you have a lot of money, or if you have a risk that you're willing to assume, say a good example of this might be Bill Gates, right? If he decides not to have health insurance, well, he can likely afford any medical operation that comes his way, right? So if he decides to self-insure and not do anything from an insurance standpoint, maybe that's a reasonable decision for him to make. For other folks, I think it's important to weigh the risk and reward of doing nothing or doing something, right? So as you go down this list for risk management options, these are all, of course, more, we'll say active as opposed to passive, right? You have to do something in order to utilize them. So futures and options Of course, they've been around for a long time. Some folks are familiar with them, but we're going to dive into those just a little bit and give a surface level summary and definitions of what they are and what they offer us in terms of information as we go forward in looking at risk management. So again, the reason for that is because we really use futures and options to kind of paint the picture of the marketplace, if you will. So other options that are available to producers are cash contracts, such as forward contracting with a co-op or an elevator. So if you're selling your milk, you can forward contract your milk potentially with the dairy that you're working with. Other options are dairy revenue protection, DRP, and LGM dairy. So those are offered through your local insurance agent, so through your crop insurance agent, if you're interested in more information on those. And then, of course, the last one that's bold there is dairy margin coverage, or DMC. And for those of you that have been familiar working in this arena for a while, I know acronyms can get to be plentiful, but the DMC program is the revised MPP dairy. So if you ever hear it, I encourage you to just make that connection, that MPP is DMC. So DMC is the revised version of that. So let's dive into a little bit of what makes the dairy market, if you will. So the futures market kind of sets the biggest backdrop for the market information that we have regarding prices of the specific commodity. So the futures market really acts as a clearinghouse for all of this relevant information. So it acts as a big giant sponge, taking all the different possible influences on the price of a commodity, such as the weather, politics, the general economic status, whatever the most recent reports are, etc., and then tries to synthesize a value or a price, if you will, that people can then find some agreement on, right, on both sides of a transaction. So, and they do this for, of course, multiple points in time. So not only for today, the specific day, but then also looking out into the future as well. So there's a couple of functions that that happen here, is that the market allows for hedgers to transfer risk. So in the dairy markets, a hedger could be a producer or farmer that is looking to manage some of his price risk. So, and then the offsetting party to that could be a buyer, such as a dairy who purchases milk from the market. So those two people could be on the side of a trade, or often or sometimes there's a speculator that is the counterparty to the hedger, and they're willing to accept the risk in taking the other side of the position in exchange for some sort of theoretical potential profit, right? So whether you're involved actively or not in hedging or taking some position in the futures market, it does allow a price discovery tool for the rest of us. So even if we're not actively taking positions in the market, we can kind of sit back and watch and see what it's doing and kind of use that as a bit of a barometer, or taking the temperature of the market for what it feels current and future prices might be. So of course, with that, there is no crystal ball, right? So futures are going to be wrong, but we don't have any evidence to suggest that they're biased or wrong in one direction or the other, that if they're consistently wrong to the low side or the high side, that evidence hasn't presented itself. So, and naturally, you know, as we get closer to the expiration date, or we'll say today's date, that we're trying to forecast or formulate or expect, the more accurate it's going to be. So the further out in time we go, the more difficult it is, of course, to forecast those prices. And also, you know, the more difficult it is to price something in the futures market. So the reason that comes into play, or how that comes into play, determining those values far out in the future, is often through options. So an option is a contract that provides the right to own the underlying future contract at a specified price. So the big kind of takeaways here, if you will, are that the cost of an option, so either the amount that you have to pay or the amount that you receive, right, for buying or selling an option, That amount is called the premium, and that premium amount reflects the likelihood that the seller of that option has to supply the underlying contract at a specific price. So a good way to think about this is that if the commodity price is hard to predict, right? If there's a lot that goes into it, if there's a lot of external forces, if there's a lot of unknown unknowns, right? Then it's what we call more volatile. And the option then costs more. Now, if the expiration is further away from today's date, we're less certain about the market conditions. That also leads to an increased cost in the option. So we can use these options prices then to calculate the future risk in a price forecast. So again, even though we know that that our forecasts are not going to be perfect and that they are going to be changing, and the chance of them being exactly correct from today's date onward are quite minimal, it still is useful to gather the information that's available, right, through the futures market, options market, to collectively paint this larger picture of the marketplace. So, and that does a couple of really important things, like we just stated, the calculation of the future price risk. So almost all of your risk management strategies or available options do come back to relate either in structure or in some way referencing these commodity market futures and options structures. So that's just kind of an important seed to keep in the back of your mind as we take a look at how some of the DMC things are structured, and then also how to use that information to compare other risk management opportunities against each other. So that leads us right into the considerations in risk management. So, you know, as with most decisions, it's probably not the best idea to jump into them without any sort of basis or grounding or information to use in order to guide that decision. So let's talk through what some of those decisions, informations, maybe guideposts that you might want to keep in mind when you're thinking about making one of these choices. So the big thing is, what risk are you managing? So there's, on the left-hand side, you can see all of the different types of risk listed. So production risk, for example, that could be if you're trying to protect change in maybe milk production, or an easy example is in corn yield, right? So production risk. And then oftentimes what we talk about in risk management, especially for dairy, is we're looking at a price or market risk. So either the futures price of a commodity or the spot price, the price that a producer actually pays or receives for what they are purchasing or what they are producing. At the end of the day, it all comes down to kind of the equation on the right-hand side. It's income minus expense equals margin. And whatever risk management tool you're using, it's going to be managing one of these three areas: income, expense, margin. So, and another important thing to think about is, what is the value? What's the value of the product that you're utilizing, but also what's the value of not utilizing, right? What's the trade-off? What's the cost benefit, if you will, of using that product? So what are the main tools that are generally available to dairy producers? Well, let's take a look at the very simple equation again. Income minus expense is margin. Well, if you're looking at managing risk on the income side, we're going to be looking at futures and options. So you can take a look and take a position on, say, class 3, right? And then that can be used to maybe set a floor or to hedge or offset your risk in the income side of that equation, the price that you receive from your milk. Another option is dairy revenue protection. And the third is milk contracts, such as we discussed before, if you have the availability to forward contract with your dairy processor. On the expense side, it looks somewhat similar. You can use futures and options to kind of hedge some of your price risk, say for feed, right? So even though it might not be exact, and by that I mean maybe alfalfa, right, doesn't have a futures contract, but you can create feed equivalents for corn and soybean meal, and then come up with some relatively similar ration that you could then try to manage some of the risk on the expense side. And then also you can use contracts. So if you have contracts with your local elevator, perhaps, or local co-op in order to contract some of your feed cost, it's another option or opportunity to manage the expense side. So finally, the one on the far right is our margin. Again, two products really stand out for this is LGM dairy, livestock gross margin dairy, and that's sold through your local crop insurance agent. And the one we're going to talk about today is dairy margin coverage. The big takeaway from this slide really is that if you're managing income, you're managing one of the three. If you're managing expense, you're managing one of the three components. But if you're managing margin, then you're managing the entire equation, right? So when you're taking a look at how to value or how to incorporate different management, risk management strategies or options, I think it's important to realize where that risk occurs in this equation to make sure that you're not just managing one side of it or the other. So let's dive into dairy margin. So DMC, dairy margin coverage, again, that sign up date is December 9th. And the mechanics this year are much the same as they were last year. So the way that it works is on the most basic level is you have an average all milk price less the value of a feed ration used to produce 100 pounds of milk. So the milk price isn't your individual milk price, but a national average milk price that we refer to as the all milk price. The all milk price includes the different levels of components in the milk, such as protein and butter fat. And the feed price is, again, not your individual feed price, but it's an estimated feed price used to produce 100 pounds of milk. So, and in that feed price, we have feed equivalents of corn, soybean meal, and premium alfalfa, or some folks call it dairy grade alfalfa. In years previous, they had alfalfa that was split 50-50 between a lower quality and a higher quality alfalfa. Now, there's no change this year. So it did in the previous round of enrollment, it was made all premium alfalfa, and that has stayed the same. So that does seem to so far be more reflective of the costs incurred in on farms. So I'd say that's a definite benefit to producers. So when you're going to make your dairy margin coverage selections, there's a couple things to consider, really two main things. So when you go to the FSA office, the two things that you're going to select are the percent coverage level of annual historic production and the margin coverage level that you would like. So if we take a look at the annual historic production, that can range from 5 to 95% of your historic production. And don't worry, we're going to take and define what historic production is here in a moment, so that way you can have a good idea of what yours might be, or how to choose your percentages. And also the coverage level. So coverage levels range from $4 a hundredweight to $9.50 a hundredweight, depending on the tier of milk production you're in. And don't worry, we'll get to that next. It'll make more sense in a moment. But one big thing to take away is that even if you have milk production that is outside of the first 5 million pounds of milk, which puts you in tier 2, you can still elect for catastrophic margin coverage at a $0 premium. So, and that catastrophic coverage level is at a $4 per hundredweight margin. So that's available regardless of the amount of production that you have. So even though the probability of such happening is low, the reward, I'll say, or the risk that you're managing versus the price that you're paying for it could be potentially quite significant. So I wouldn't write it off as an option, that's for sure. So I mentioned that there's a tiered system in DMC. So the tiered system basically breaks out your production. So the first tier is the first 5 million pounds of annual production. And the second tier is annual production in excess of, right? So that next 5,000,001 pound of annual production that's produced then falls into tier 2. So on the far right column here, let's take a look at what the big differences are between these two tiers. So the first tier, your margin levels that you can select from range from $4 per hundredweight of margin to $9.50 of margin per hundredweight. Now for tier 2, which is for production above the first 5 million pounds, the range shrinks from $4.95 to $4 and I think I said that wrong. So tier 1 margin levels, the very top right box, $4 and $9.50. For tier 2, the margin is $4 to $8 per hundredweight. So again, in tier 2, that highest level that you can select goes from $9.50 to $8. Also in tier 2, you can see that the premium range, the producer premium range is quite a bit wider as well. In tier 1, the highest premium that you would be paying is 15 cents per hundredweight, where in the tier 2 production, the highest premium is $1, say $1.81-ish plus a, excuse me, plus a little bit. So that's the biggest thing to consider for the tiers. So I think right now would be a great time. If we have a question, let's take it. And I'm going to take a quick drink here.
And the chat's pretty
Perfect.
quiet.
Perfect. Hey, we'll take it. Feel free to ask as we go. We'll take another quick break for questions in a moment. So keep them coming in if you have any. Let's take a look at the dairy margin coverage annual historic production. So this is really what establishes the amount of milk that you can have enrolled in the program. So your AHP, or your annual historic production, is the higher of your 2011, 2012, or 2013 production, right? So that is how it is currently calculated. In the previous Farm Bill, they allowed for supplemental DMC coverage so that you can increase the amount of production that you have, that you can have covered by your DMC enrollment. So, and to do that, they use your actual history, the actual pounds of milk that you produced in 2019 as the reference point for that inclusion. So additional information on supplemental DMC is that it only applies to producers under 5 million pounds. Again, that's tier 1 of annual historic production in 2011 through 2013. So if you elect supplemental DMC, then your annual production history is based on the higher of the 2011, 2012, 2013, and 3/4 or 75% of your 2019 production. So I know this is a big sticking point for a lot of folks on how to best understand this. So let's just walk through a quick decision tree, and then after that, a calculation on it. So the best way to think about this that I found is to ask yourself, have you previously enrolled in supplemental DMC? If you have, then no action taken. If not, then figure out, is your 2011, 12, or 13 annual historic production greater than 5 million pounds? If it is, then no action is necessary. And the reason for that is that supplemental DMC only applies to the first 5 million pounds. If the answer is no, then your 2019 annual historic production is that greater than your 2011 through 2013 annual historic production. If it is, then consider enrolling in supplemental DMC. If it is not, then no action taken. If this is still maybe a little tricky or difficult to understand, if you bring in your actual milk marketings to the FSA office when you go to enroll, and you ask them for more information or to provide some guidance on the coverage here, they'll be happy to do so and be able to provide a specific answer to what your questions are. So let's take a look at the very bottom of this slide where it says the new annual historic production. So the numbers in this equation here are from the example above. So let's assume that we had 2 million pounds previously as our AHP. Well, what we're going to do is take our new milk marketings, which would be our milk marketings from 2019, where we had 4.5 million pounds. So we're going to take 4.5 million pounds, and then we're going to subtract our original AHP of 2 million pounds. And then we're going to multiply that by 0.75 or 75%. Again, the reason is because we are taking the additional amount that was produced, or the new amount, in order to adjust our historic production level. And then add back in our original 2 million pounds. And then in this example, we'll end up with a 3.875 million pounds as our new annual historic production. So we'll go from the 2 million to the 3.8 million. All right, this is probably the part that most people use when thinking of what they want to do in a risk management strategy, is kind of taking a look at what happened previously and then what's forecasted to happen. While that may not be wrong, I would encourage you to take an additional approach to that as well, and to think not only about historic performance or forecast, but really think about what it means to not utilize something. So if you're utilizing or thinking of enrolling simply to make a profit or game a system, if you will, that really isn't, we'll say, terrific risk management. So I think a better approach is to think about what the cost would be of not doing something if markets do change in a direction that's not in your favor. So let's take a look at what the 2020 to 2022 USDA DMC reported prices were. So the top line, we have US all milk price. That red line is our total feed cost, and that orange colored line is our margin above feed cost for this period. There's two specific points that I'd like you to take a look at. Let's take a look at approximately that April-May of 2020, where we can see that milk prices came down quite a bit and fairly dramatically, because we're going to be referencing that in a second, and is important to keep in mind. And then also that the margin, especially as we get towards 2022 here, towards the end of the year, has been dipping down a bit, has a bit of a upward trend right at the end there, but as we'll see in a moment, that may or may not be carrying through. So based on the information from the previous slide, we can calculate the DMC payments that were made at a margin coverage level of $9.50 from the same time period. So as I mentioned before, on the that April-May period of 2020, you can see that we had a really big payout, almost $4.50 per hundredweight. Well, what's interesting there is at the time of that indemnity payment, that was the highest indemnity payment, or the lowest margin, if you will, that the program had seen to date at that time. So, and actually at the start of that year, there was no forecasted margin payment to happen. So the forecasted margin during that period, the lowest was $9. So you would have maybe had a 50-cent forecasted premium, potentially, and but mostly ranged from that $9.50 to $11 during that time period. So I think that's a good example of how what we might be forecasting right now does not necessarily mean it will come to fruition later. So also in the fall of 2020, as you can see, so right around, say, October, November of 2020, the forecast for all of 2021 was $11 in margin. Well, as you can see, we had quite a few payments through all of 2021. So that means that our margin definitely was not $11 a hundredweight. So I think that's important to consider that simply, even if we do use all the information available to us, it's not nothing is a sure thing, right? So we don't want to assume that just because a forecast says something, that we're not taking appropriate action. So this is the actual and forecasted dairy margin from 2019 through the end of this year. The dashed lines there are the forecasted price, and that middle yellow is the historic third of margin values from 2010 to the present. Again, when you take and if you overlaid where people thought the forecasts would predict margin to be, or we'll say where the USDA FSA model predicted the forecast to be, those lines would look dramatically different than what the actual is. So as you can see back in in 2020, where we had that large first dip down, that was very unexpected and not forecasted at all. So if you were not signed up because you assumed that margin was going to stay around that $11 per hundredweight level, you could have really missed out on some pretty significant risk management opportunities there that could have made a fairly large difference in your operation. So, and again, where we saw those high payments in 2021, you can see on this graph where the red line goes through that margin was, quite a bit lower. So the program is working the way that that it is intended. So now let's take a look at that dashed line. Right now, that forecast does look to be, say, between that $9.50 and $8 level. So while that does look like to trigger a payment, you might be thinking it may not be substantial, but let's kind of dive into that a little further and break it down. On this top line, the top red line, we have our forecasted all milk price for 2023, and that comes in at $21.80. Now, below that in the green, we have our average feed cost, and the average for that year is $13.68. So if I was using this as a budgeting tool, I would think pretty strongly about having my budgeted feed cost per hundredweight, at least according to this, at about $14 a hundredweight for the year. I think that would provide you some good numbers to at least reference. And then that very bottom line is our margins, right? So the difference between the all milk price and the feed cost. As you can see, that margin does tend up over the year through 2023. Now, first of all, that's forecasted. Second of all, let's take a look at where that's coming from. We see that top red line, the all milk price, is generally pretty level throughout the whole year. But our feed cost is what's driving that margin up. So the drop in the feed cost is kind of pulling that margin up. Now, for those that have been around the feed cost side of it for a while, I think it's pretty safe to say that you've experienced quite a range and fluctuation in that feed cost. And I think the likelihood of feed costs changing by even a little bit, much less some significant amount over the next 6-12 months is quite high. There's a lot of factors that can play into that. And there's still a lot of uncertainty in the market right now. So, assuming that it's going to stay in that range or about that may not be the best risk management decision. So speaking of feed cost, this graph here takes a look at what feed cost is, or what the feed cost is forecasted to be in that green box. And then right next to the green and that red is your milk price trigger. So the milk price trigger is the milk price that would need to be received, right? That level, that milk price or lower would trigger a payment. Now that orange arrow on there is the margin. So whatever size, whatever margin coverage level you select is the size of that orange arrow. So in this case, it's $9.50 a hundredweight is the margin coverage level. So it'd be the forecasted feed price plus $9.50 to equal your milk price trigger. So the line that goes horizontally across there in gray is the 2023 currently forecasted all milk price. So the all milk price currently is forecasted to be lower in all 12 months than what the trigger price would be if you select the $9.50 per hundredweight coverage level. Now, I do want to touch on tier 2 production choices. So I think we'd be remiss to at least not point out the difference between going to the market and purchasing a put option versus utilizing the DMC program if you're looking to utilize this as a risk management tool on your additional pounds of production that are greater than your 5 million pounds. So on the left, we have a $6 margin coverage level, and on the right, we have an $8 margin coverage level. So the blue box, let's take a look at the graph on the left, the blue or the $6 margin coverage level. The blue box is the premium that you would pay for the $6, which would be 31 cents through DMC. Now, the gray box is the CME put option price at the milk trigger price at a $6 coverage level. So the big comparison here is to take a look at the difference in size between the gray bars and the blue bars. So at a $6 margin coverage level, you can see that the DMC premium does come at quite a discount compared to going to the open market and purchasing a put option on the same dollar value of coverage. And then on the $8 level margin coverage on the right, it shows the same thing, but as you can see, that discount is still there, but it may not be as large as it is in the lower levels. So I just bring that up because I think it's important to consider when taking a look at tier 2 milk production, everything above that 5 million pound mark. And if you're going to use a risk management strategy to try to manage some of your price risk, that it's might be wise to take a look at this as an option versus going to the futures market and not having this in your consideration set. It may prove to save you some premium in the long run. So now let's take a look at the dairy margin web tool, so that way you can use it to input your information and make a decision on your specific operation. Before we do that, do we have any questions that came in? All right,
There
hearing
are
none.
No
Perfect.
questions in the chat box yet.
So this is the online tool that you can utilize in order to figure out what your options look like. So the website is dmc.dairymarkets.org. When utilizing it, go ahead and take a look at your selection year. So that's the first place that I'd like you to look and to note when you pull this up. So that way you're utilizing the appropriate year when making your decision. So after that, let's just go keep moving right. In the annual historic production column, you would put the amount.
Leonard, we can't see that's the decision tool.
Oh, thank you. 1 second. How about now?
Yes.
Perfect. So in the drop down, this is the drop down for the year. Make sure it is in the current year or the upcoming year, 2023. In the annual historic production, this would be the highest level of those years, 2011, 12, 13, plus the supplemental if you're qualified for that you would put in here. This would be, again, we said there's 2 things that you as a producer are taking a look at to see what your selection criteria are. This is one of them. The percent coverage of your annual historic production. In this case, let's go 95%. And then also your coverage level on the left-hand side here. So from $4 to $9.50 per hundredweight. These are empty, and that's empty by design, because again, when you are in tier 2 production, so everything above this initial 5 million pounds, the highest coverage level that's available to you is $8 of margin. So if you're interested, you can poke around and choose the different selection coverage levels. So that way you can see what your premium would be based on your individual annual historic production. I do encourage you to take a look at the very bottom row here. It's $4 of margin for a cost of $0. So, and that is available for tier 2 as well. So probably a great thing to consider. Now let's take a look at some of the other tabs across the top here. Again, whenever you do change a tab, I do encourage you to take a look at your selected year to make sure that is that is the year that you want to look at. So that way you're making decisions with the appropriate information. So the net benefit forecast simply tells you the forecasted margin, right? And then it can also pull in your information that you put in to the system to tell you what payments might look like. So right now we selected that $0 coverage level. Let's go back here once and select this $9.50 coverage level. Now we can see that our total payments or our net benefit forecast would be this total on the bottom. So, and again, the way that's calculated is the all milk price less the forecasted margin. All right, and now speaking of forecasted price, that is found here. So if you're interested in how that's calculated or what's being pulled in, you can take a look. We have our all milk price and then our feed components here with our with the second to last column, the feed cost forecast, and then finally at the very far right, the DMC margin forecast per hundredweight. And then this is the historic performance of the program. If you're interested, of course, feel free to take a look. One thing I do want to touch on here is this milk price payment trigger analysis. So those bar charts that I showed you previously are just a different way to visualize this. But what you can do is put in your local basis. In Wisconsin, our local basis is a little bit better than the rest of the country. But for this example, let's just put in $1. So if our forecasted feed cost is in this column and the coverage level is $9.50 and our local basis is $1, then that gives us a milk price trigger of approximately $25.07. So this tells you what the milk price, or this tells you what milk price will trigger a payment, that or below, right? So as you go in time, again, this number decreases, but a lot of that is driven by what our forecasted feed cost is. So again, a great place to start with your coverage selection, enter your production history, and then select your coverage level. All in all, I will say, kind of to wrap it up here, that I think this year, selecting something is, we'll say, relatively easier than previous years. I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the market that has a potential to influence both your income and expense side on either direction in substantial ways, right? So for a at least for tier 1 production, your first 5 million pounds for 15 cents, you know, I think that it is not unreasonable to make that selection at all and to utilize that as a strong risk management tool in your toolkit. Again, sign-up dates are December 9th, coming up quickly. And when you do go to your FSA office, they do have a enrollment fee or administrative fee of $100. And one thing too to keep in mind is that when you do enroll in the program, the premium is not due at that time. The premium is deducted from your indemnities as you receive them. So that is a big benefit as well to producers. So that way they don't need to, cut a check or incur that expense. They can utilize the risk management benefit of the program in order to cover some of that premium as well. So with that, I want to say thank you everybody for participating in this. Hopefully it did clear up some of the questions that are out there. And then I do look forward to your questions. So I do see there is one question in here that says, what is the outlook of the DMC program beyond 2023 as far as the new Farm Bill is concerned? So the outlook for DMC was, I'll break this down in two ways. The outlook for DMC and the price forecasting, I know that's not the specific question you asked, but I want to touch on that quickly. The outlook for the price forecast, I actually did all the way through 2024, and currently 2024 looks to sit very similar in 2023 in that every month the looks to trigger a payment at that 950 level. So I found that very interesting and a bit telling that the market right now isn't showing a large propensity or we'll say willingness to change hard in one direction or the other. So it seems to kind of want to go right down the middle of the road that we're currently looking at the moment. Now, as far as the new Farm Bill is concerned, I guess I can't provide too much specific insight on that as it's yet to be seen. If we take a look at the coverage level selections here, there is talk of some of this potentially changing, that maybe the tiers will increase in size. So tier 1, for example, instead of being 5 million pounds, potentially larger, maybe increase a coverage level, right? So maybe from 950 to say 10 or something like this. As far as the, we'll say economics of that is concerned, it all kind of depends on how much money is allocated or appropriated to the tool and to this program, because really what they have to do is take that total pool of money and then find a way to, essentially distribute it through this mechanism, right? So while there's a lot of talk on, different potential changes and tweaks, I don't think the program is going anywhere. I think it's been, successful for what it was intended. And, there may be some small tweaks along the way. Right now, it doesn't seem like there's a huge chatter or propensity for it to change substantially, I would say, at this moment in time. So the question is, how does the local basis, or $1 in this example, come into play for calculating program payments? All right, so I'm going to answer that part of the question beforehand, or before I get to the rest of it. The answer is it doesn't. It is just your, that's used for your reference and your information. So that way you can have a better idea of what your milk check or milk price received will look like. Honestly, when I go to make a decision on this, and when I go to do the math, I generally leave the local basis out, simply because, like, if you're getting, say, a premium of $1 a hundredweight or quality premiums or something like this, oftentimes you just kind of have the understanding of that, and then can add that, knowledge or reference back in towards the end. That's generally how I tend to do it. But one of the nice things about DMC versus other programs is that you don't need to report your current year information. So for example, for 2023, say is 3 months down the road and you receive an indemnity payment, FSA is not going to take your specific milk production for that month in which that indemnity payment occurred. So that's why they use that annual historic production number in order to set your premiums and your production coverage levels at. So again, hopefully that answers your question for the $1 part of that. A lot of that is just for your information, so you can have a better understanding of what it means in your operation. So the next part of that is, yeah, any planned assessment factor in the program payment triggers. No. So that is one thing when you're looking at other tools, say DRP or LGM Dairy, their reporting requirements for actual milk marketings are different than DMC. So for those programs, you do have to report, depending on what you select and depending on how you decide to enroll in the programs, either pounds of production or amounts of protein or amount of butter fat actually produced over that period. So it does mean that the reporting or we'll say the involvement level in that program is generally a little higher. So for DMC, it is quite simple to utilize and does make it easy for the producer to manage throughout the life cycle of that enrollment period, right? Because you really just go to the FSA office, you enroll, and then the rest of it is kind of set already from the start. So thank you for the question. So
Okay,
again,
looks like that kind of cleared up the questions. If anybody has any further ones, do feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you want to unmute, you can do that. On the other thing that we put up, you might have noticed as we're going through those questions, we do have a couple of evaluation questions. If you could fill those out for us, we'd really appreciate it. It helps make sure that we can bring programs like this to you. So we really appreciate it if you can take a couple minutes and fill that out for us, and just kind of looking to see if we had any more questions in the chat. Looks like it's pretty quiet.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. I'm more than willing to stick around for a bit if there is a question. And if you have a question that maybe you don't want included in the recording or anything like this, feel free to let us know as well, and we can answer that towards the end too. So more than willing to hang around for those folks that are looking for additional information. So thank you very much. Hopefully you're at a minimum, at least go to the FSA office, talk to them, share your information if you have not already enrolled or if you've never enrolled, and at least take a look at what it does mean specifically for your farm. Utilize the DMC dairymarkets.org tool. Make the most informed decision possible, because like I said before, a lot of times right now we're forecasting some payments. It doesn't mean it will happen, but also it doesn't mean that the payments could be much larger, right? So there's a lot of risk out there in the market at the moment, and I think this is a terrific way to manage that at a relatively affordable rate. So thank you again. Hopefully this was a benefit, and look forward to working with all of you again in the future.
All right, thanks everyone. We appreciate you joining today. And with that, we'll wrap up the webinar.